Okay, next campaign, I think, I know what I'm going to do. I'll have my players get caught in a tornado where they're whisked off to an incredible, colorful, magical land, only to find out that they have been caught in a brutal battle to the death between two witches over a pair of shoes. My players will have to team up with a pair of constructs and an awakened lion in an attempt to make their way home. Yeah, that sounds amazing. Oh, come on. I know there's got to be at least 5 other storytellers out there who've thought about using Wizard of Oz as inspiration for their campaigns. Today, let's talk about planar environments in Pathfinder 2nd Edition on this episode of The Local Disaster Tour Guide. Hello travelers and tourists, my name is Mark and I am the local disaster tour guide. That's right, I am a storyteller that has just about had it with these interplanar python infestations. Maybe that joke was a little too obscure. Welcome to a journey through the fantastic world of TTRPGs like Pathfinder and Starfinder. Today, we're going to be continuing my Storytelling in Pathfinder 2e series and taking a look at the rules for planar environments in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. Now, in this series, we take a look at the advice, the tips, the tricks that Paizo offers storytellers in Pathfinder 2e to help us improve our craft. Recently, we have been working through the different modes of play in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, including Encounter Mode, Exploration Mode, and Downtime Mode, and right now we're working on Exploration Mode, the mode that focuses the most on the world that our players are inhabiting. Exploration Mode is all about exploring the environment, getting to know the world around them, and discovering unique, interesting things about the play space that we have given our players. Now, we've been talking about several different aspects of the environment recently in this series. We've talked about terrain, we've talked about weather, and the last video we talked about natural disasters for the game masters that want to chuck lava bombs at their players. But today we're taking a look at a final element of the environment that's worth discussing, which is planar environments. You see, one of the fun things about fantasy RPGs is our characters don't have to stick to just the world that they were born onto. The core setting for Pathfinder 2e is the world of Golarion, and I love the world of Golarion, but one of the great things about this game is our characters can go and barter on the plane of Axis. They can travel to heaven and see firsthand what the afterlife looks like, and they might literally dive into the abyss in an effort to rescue a lost soul. The idea of characters being able to travel beyond their home world or their home plane is one of those fun, interesting niches in fantasy storytelling, so I think it's worth talking at least a little bit about the kind of environments that are associated with interplanar adventures and travel. So the goal today is to focus specifically on interplanar environments and the different traits or effects that you want to be mindful of as a storyteller when you are telling these types of stories. Now, really quick, I'll go ahead and say, I'm not going to be talking about the full scope of planar adventures and everything that could go into planar adventures in this video, just because there is a ton of content related to planar adventures. For example, in the Game Mastery Guide, they give us 22 different planes that characters could go to and make reference to many other demi-planes or alternative options that a storyteller might use. That's a ton of content, and I'll be revisiting some of that content when we get into some bigger picture ideas and discussions on how to construct stories. For now, we are focused specifically on planar environments. One of the things I like to do in this video is give you some references that you can read up on these topics if you're interested in going a little more in depth. In particular today, we're taking a look at pages 136 to 138 of the Game Mastery Guide for Pathfinder 2nd Edition, which specifically talks about different planar traits that are used to describe planar environments. If you're interested in reading up on specific planes, again, we're not going to dive into that for this video, but if you want to read up on some specific planes, pages 138 to 145 of the Game Mastery Guide is where you can go to get an introduction to some of the different planes in the core Pathfinder 2e setting. Additionally, many of the rules and the tables that we've been talking about in the last couple of videos, such as environmental damage or temperature effects, things like that, any and all of those could be very useful if you're planning an interplanar game as well, so consider those to still be relevant to the conversation. One last reference I'd like to throw out today, and this one is going to be a little bit of a niche reference, but one of the best RP books I've ever seen on the subject of interplanar games is Legends and Lairs, Portal and Planes for Dungeons & Dragons 3.0 3.5. This was published by Fantasy Flight Games in 2003, so this book is about 19 years old, and it was written by Mike Merles. And I just want to say that of the various books I've read over the years on interplanar adventures, this is easily the best. It was written for a different game system, so if you were to look this book up, there's definitely going to be some translation and number crunching you'll have to do as a storyteller, but if you want to go in depth on this subject, I really like this book. This is easily one of my top 10 role-playing books of all time. But with those references out of the way, let's get started. Now, I do want to go on a small tangent here at the beginning of this conversation of planar traits and talk a little bit about the big picture of interplanar stories, and that is interplanar stories are typically going to be high-level stories or high-level threats that you throw at your players. These are not stories, these are not options that you are typically going to be using with a low-level party. In fact, in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, the first rules element that I am personally aware of in regards to interplanar options for your PCs is the Planar Survival skill feat, which is available at character level 7. I'm not aware of any rule from level 1 to level 6 that is specifically designed for interplanar play when it comes to your characters, and that should give you a pretty good idea of, until your PCs hit about level 7, they are probably not going to be well prepared for any kind of planar adventure. And even then, level 7 is just the earliest stages. Most of the rules elements for interplanar games or options show up around level 13. For example, the classic spell, Plane Shift, is a level 7 spell, which means level 13 is the earliest that your players will be able to access it. It's also worth noting that a lot of interplanar hazards, such as the Planar Rift hazard, show up around level 13 as well, so the benchmarks for interplanar play don't even really show up before level 7 and don't get serious until around level 13. And a lot of the interplanar rules carry on to around levels 18, 19, 20, something like that, so as a game master, be aware that these stories do tend to skew towards higher level play. So that raises the question, can a game master use interplanar options at all at lower levels, or do you have to wait entirely until higher levels in order to make use of these kinds of stories? And the answer to that is not necessarily. One of the easiest options if you want to make use of interplanar environments is the classic portals. This is an easy way to give your characters quick access to other planes, other locations, and the concept of gaining access to a portal, defending a portal, or closing a portal can make for interesting stories early on inside of your campaign. Also, it's worth noting that even if your players cannot travel to other planes, you can use small amounts of interplanar magic to create weird environments or weird effects for lower level encounters and story arcs. Your characters may not be able to go to the plane of fire at low levels, but they might be charged with driving a group of fire elementals that have escaped from that plane back through the portal and then closing it so that no more damage will get done to their hometown. Another thing worth noting is, because of the high-level nature of interplanar stories, giving your villain access to a hideout or a base on another plane is a great way to prevent your players from confronting a villain too early in a story. If you want to save a villain for a later date, give them a retreat that is hidden in the abyss or the boneyard or something like that, and players will have to go on major adventures to even gain access to the villain's lair. So even if your players are too low level to actually travel to other planes, that doesn't mean you can't be thinking about interplanar environments, because you can still come up with some fun stories for your players that can hint towards the higher level play that they will eventually see. But now that we're leaving the world of Golarion and stepping into these crazy magical planes, we need to begin to ask ourselves, what kind of environments can our players encounter on other planes, or how could planar magic mess with an environment should it bleed onto the prime material plane? The first set of traits that we're going to talk about today are enhanced magic, impeded magic, alignment traits, and essence traits. So one of the core things to remember about interplanar adventures is this is the definition of a high magic campaign setting. The plane of fire is literally a plane that is constantly on fire. This is the kind of crazy, wild stuff that you don't encounter in everyday life, and one of the keys to good interplanar storytelling is to establish this sense of a very magical environment, and the enhanced and impeded magical traits give us a glimpse at one of the easiest ways to do that. Since planes are a high magic environment, it is worth noting that often a plane will affect the types of magic that a player character can use. Now, most of the time, magic will function normally, regardless of if a player is on the material plane or one of the random outer planes, inner planes, what have you. But sometimes, planes will enhance or impede certain types of magic based on the nature of the plane itself. For example, the plane of fire will naturally enhance fire magic, while at the same time impeding water magic. So let's talk about those terms enhanced and impeded and what those mean mechanically really quick. Enhanced is very simple. Anytime a PC uses a kind of magic that is enhanced on a given plane, they gain a +1 bonus to any spell attack rolls or spell DCs for magic with the appropriate trait. Impeded magic is also pretty simple, but a little more harsh if you ask me. If a character attempts to cast a spell that is impeded on a given plane, they must attempt a flat check with a DC of 6 to find out whether or not they can successfully cast the spell. If they fail the check, they lose the spell and the actions that goes with it. So one thing that characters will need to be mindful of in traveling to other planes is that they need to consider what spells they use, prepare, or access, because certain spells may function better than normal, while other spells may fizzle completely without warning. The most common traits that will enhance or impede magic are alignment traits or essence traits. These are not exclusive to the enhanced or impeded effects, but these are probably the most common ones you will deal with. Alignment effects would be things like the good alignment being associated with the plane of heaven. Any spell with the good trait is enhanced while you're in heaven, and if you attempt to cast an evil spell in heaven, so many jokes about my players right now. Those evil spells run the risk of simply fizzling because they run counter to the very nature or essence of the plane that your players are exploring. And a similar process would apply. Evil magic would be enhanced in the abyss, while good magic would be impeded. Player characters that find their way to Axis would see lawful magic enhanced with chaotic magic impeded, and the Maelstrom would enhance chaotic magic and impede lawful magic. And there are plenty of other examples of alignment traits. Those are just 4 quick ones that you can reference. Essence traits will function similar to alignment, but are not necessarily tied to moral concepts. Essence traits include things like air, earth, fire, water, positive, negative, and shadow. And with all of these, again, the effects are typically going to be easy to discern. On the plane of earth, Earth magic is enhanced and air magic is impeded, and the opposite is true on the plane of air. We've already talked about how the plane of fire would enhance fire magic, while the plane of water would impede fire magic and enhance water magic instead. The negative and positive traits being applied to a plane would enhance and impede magic appropriately. And then planes with the shadow trait would enhance spells with the darkness or shadow traits and would impede spells with the light trait. Now, it is worth noting that essence traits often have effects beyond just enhancing or impeding magic. For example, planes with the shadow trait don't just impede light magic, but actually cut the radius of any light effect on the plane in half. Elemental traits like earth, fire, air, and water can be comforting or uncomfortable to elemental creatures of the corresponding traits, and can also cause environmental damage to creatures that make their way to that plane, especially the plane of fire. Planes with the negative trait can also deal environmental damage to players, and a character that dies from the environmental damage of such a plane actually comes back as a wraith after their body disintegrates to ash. Planes with a positive trait seem safer at first glance, healing players and even granting them temporary HP if they go above their normal health maximum. But don't be deceived, because positive planes can be just as dangerous. If those temporary hit points go too high, the character literally explodes in a glorious burst of positive energy. Man, these rules are crazy. I thought I was being mean talking about natural disasters. But those are just some quick examples of how enhanced and impeded magic can work, and of alignment and essence traits that can correspond to such things. But let's move beyond the basics of enhancing and impeding magic to some more entertaining traits that you can play with when you're describing different interplanar environments. Let's talk about morphic traits and what they might mean to a different plane. Morphic traits represent how an environment can be changed and what is capable of modifying an environment. Most planes are going to have normal morphic traits, which means that the environment is relatively stable and that the environment responds to forces and changes just like it would if it was the prime material plane. Then you have metamorphic, which can be used to represent a plane that is much more malleable than normal. These planes can be changed by certain creatures or certain forces, and the Game Mastery Guide here doesn't give us specific examples, but this is something that you can very easily play with as a storyteller, deciding that certain creatures, maybe even the player characters themselves, could have the ability to change certain aspects of the plane just by thinking about it hard enough, or maybe if you want to be a little more balanced, by using certain spells or spell effects to modify the environment around them. The flip side of a metamorphic trait is the static trait. This represents a plane that does not change, no matter what you do to it. Oftentimes this might be used for planes that are dead or locked in some fashion, and your players are completely incapable of changing things in that plane or moving things in that plane unless they find some way to overcome the static trait. The last and easily the most entertaining for game masters out there is the sentient trait. This represents a plane that is normally stable and reacts much like a normal environment would, but it is capable of changing when and how it desires to. That's right, the sentient plane applies to a location that has its own will and purpose and is capable of modifying itself to help or hinder creatures that may have found their way into its presence. This is basically the equivalent of taking a haunted house and cranking it up to 11. If you're a game master, don't overlook this beautiful option. Beyond just the environment itself, though, there are other things that you can play with as a storyteller, and one of the traits that you can mess around with is gravity. Now, many planes will have normal gravity, which means that gravity on that plane works just like it would on the prime material plane. Go to Galarian, go to the plane, it's no different. However, you can also have things like high or low gravity, representing a location where gravity might be weaker or stronger than anticipated. On a high gravity plane, The bulk of items is effectively doubled for your characters, and your characters will find themselves moving at half speed because they're not used to how much gravity that they're dealing with. If a character takes a fall in a high gravity location, their falling damage will actually equal the total distance that they fell, effectively causing them to take double damage relative to what they would experience in a normal world. Finally, ranged weapons are less useful in a high gravity environment, and ranged attacks become impossible after 3 range increments. Low gravity environments are the reverse of this. Instead of doubling the bulk of items, cut it in half. Creatures can carry twice as much as they normally could, and they can jump twice as far. Instead of doubling the falling damage, a character that falls in a low gravity environment would only take damage equal to 1/4 of the distance that they actually fell. And ranged attacks in a low gravity environment are actually more plausible. Characters will find that they're able to fire up to 12 range increments away. But these are just basic ways of manipulating gravity. There are definitely other fun options here. One is microgravity, where functionally there is no gravity. Characters are just floating in space, and if they want to move around, they have to bounce off of objects or find different ways to push and pull themselves through the environment because gravity is not naturally taking them in any direction. Another option, if you're a fan of the movie Labyrinth, is strange gravity, where as long as the object is big enough, a character can treat any object that they are capable of standing on as down, functionally allowing characters to traverse up walls and across ceilings and walk across all sorts of other interesting objects. Another option for gravity is the subjective gravity trait, where a character decides for themselves what direction is down. This functionally gives a character a form of pseudo-flight, and you would actually use the fly action and acrobatic skill checks for a character to be able to maneuver themselves through a subjective gravity environment. This could lead to all sorts of twisting, turning, and interesting combats as your characters maneuver through a 3D space where they get to decide which way is up, which way is down, and which way they want to travel. Since planar environments are allowing us to modify anything and everything, why, as a game master, should we just think in 3 dimensions when we can think in 4? Let's talk about time. That's right, one of the things that you can play around with interplanar environments is the measurement and passage of time. Now, planes can have a normal time trait, meaning that time on one plane passes at the same rate that it does on the prime material plane. However, there are other traits as well. One of them is flowing, which means that as a game master, you can decide that time passes differently on the plane than it does in the prime material plane. For example, a player may go to a plane with the flowing trait, spend an hour doing different things there, and come back only to discover that a day has passed in the real world. As a game master, you get to decide how much faster or slower time passes on this plane relative to the character's home. But if that's not crazy enough, you can also go with the erratic time trait. Now, they have a specific example of the erratic trait in the Game Mastery Guide, but as a Game Master, this is definitely something you can play around with. The basic idea is time is erratic when you go in and out of that plane. About 50% of the time, time moves normally. But anytime you travel into or out of the plane, you attempt a DC 11 flat check to determine whether or not it's different this time. If the characters fail the check, time passes a little bit differently, and if the characters critically fail the check, there is a major difference in how time flows relative from the plane to the prime material. Now, it does note that characters that travel to and from the plane together use the same roll to determine the effects, but the erratic nature of a plane could make journeys into and out of the plane very risky for your players and lead to some very interesting stories. The final trait you can use to describe time is the timeless trait. And basically what that means is that while a character is on a timeless plane, though time moves, it doesn't affect the character. They could spend a week, a month, a year, or even longer on this plane and be completely or at least relatively unaffected by the passage of time. But there is a danger that comes with timeless planes, in that when a character leaves the timeless plane and goes back to normal, time catches up with them. If they have spent too long on that plane, they may begin to starve, dehydrate, or even die of old age as the flow of time catches back up with their body. This could make for a cunning and dangerous trap to throw at some of your player characters. But those are just a sampling of some of the different traits that you can play with to make for unique, interesting, and chaotic environments to throw at your players and allow for some very unusual stories to be told. This is just scratching the surface. Like I mentioned, that book, Portals and Planes, talks about a variety of other options if you really want to go deep on this subject, but let me turn the conversation over to you. What are your thoughts on interplanar environments, and what are some suggestions you would offer about how a game master can play with the environment around their PCs to create new and interesting stories? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Also, if you enjoyed this video, like it, share it, subscribe to the channel. You can check out my free Discord group. I have a link to that in the video description, along with a link to my Patreon page. And as always, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for being a part of the conversation, and have a wonderful day.